So the goal of this video is to start to understand the Russia-Ukraine crisis. I think there's a few different perspectives we can take. So the first is going to be from The Economist.
The world's attention is on the border between Russia and Ukraine, the site of the biggest military buildup in Europe since the Cold War. Russia has already annexed Crimea, part of Ukrainian territory, and plunged Donbass in Ukraine's southeast into a separate conflict.
Our allies and partners are ready to impose severe cost and significant harm on Russia and the Russian economy.
If Russia changes borders again by force, this will be a challenge to whole of European security.
But how did Ukraine become a flashpoint between Russia and the West? And why won't Russia leave Ukraine alone?
I don't think that Putin's finished with Ukraine. I don't think he will leave Ukraine unmolested.
Vladimir Putin disputes whether a border between Russia and Ukraine should exist.
Мы не просто близкие соседи. Мы фактически, как я уже много раз говорил, один народ.
He says that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, and has claimed that Ukraine isn't a state, but Ukraine is proud of its independence.
Ми молода країна з тисячолітньою історією.
Russia and Ukraine do have a shared ancestry. A union between Moscow and Kiev in the 17th century formed the base of the Russian Empire. Moscow considers Kiev the cradle of its civilization and its faith. Over the centuries since, the two countries have been intimately connected. Ukraine was a cornerstone of the Soviet Union until the bloc collapsed in 1991. At the time, Ukrainian independence went hand in hand with a new democratic Russia.
Ukraine in many ways set the example for Russia's own independence from the Soviet Union and the idea of Russia as a democratic republic.
But over the years, Moscow came to view Ukraine's independence as a strategic blow, as well as an emotional one. Today, around 13% of Ukrainians are ethnically Russian, and nearly a third speak Russian as a first language. But despite these ties, recent events are turning many Ukrainians against Russia.
It's a country which is responsible for 14,000 dead soldiers and civilians in the war in the east of Ukraine. It's a country that grabbed part of their territory. It's the country that poses constant threat.
75% of Ukrainians born since 1991 now see their future as in the EU, rather than with Russia. But a democratic Ukraine with ties to the West is unacceptable to Russia, mainly due to Ukraine's strategic significance. Ukraine is caught between two spheres of influence, the West and its defensive alliance NATO on one side, and Russia on the other. Vladimir Putin is determined to keep Ukraine in Russia's orbit and keep it out of alliances with others.
Putin doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO because he now sees it as antagonistic towards Russia. A fellow Slavic country, as he says, the same people as us, as a member of NATO, as part of the West, is an affront.
In 1991, NATO's borders in Central Europe only ran as far east as Germany. But as former Soviet bloc countries joined, the NATO alliance in Central Europe now runs in some places right up to the Russian border. Ukraine itself separates Russia from 4 NATO members. As far as Russia is concerned, Ukraine must never join NATO. And for Ukraine's first years of independence, that didn't seem likely. Ukraine was led by governments friendly to Moscow. But by Ukraine's 2004 presidential elections, it was clear Ukrainians had begun to look westwards, and Russia's influence had its limits. With the help of mass protests, Putin-backed candidate Viktor Yanukovych lost to pro-Western Viktor Yushchenko. It became known as the Orange Revolution, and was evident that Russia was losing control of Ukraine.
Orange Revolution, it mattered because people rose against somebody he backed. It showed that people have agency.
Even when Yanukovych was voted in 5 years later, Putin still couldn't get his own way in Ukraine. Yanukovych continued to look both ways, to Europe and to Russia. When Ukraine was offered an association agreement with the EU, Putin countered with an economic offer of his own. Yanukovych eventually ditched the EU deal in favor of the economic pact with Russia. But many Ukrainians felt sold out, and peaceful protests in Kiev followed. Yanukovych's response was brutal, sparking further demonstrations and the downfall of his government. It was a slap in the face for Putin.
Video has emerged which appears to show President Yanukovych's entourage fleeing from his luxurious mansion outside Kiev.
Putin was furious. He was coming after similar protests in Russia. He had to make an example of Ukraine. He had to show that such events, revolutions, end badly and they end in civil war.
Putin's response was to annex the Ukrainian territory of Crimea.
So I think the basic argument here is Putin, as a Russian dictator, is threatened by Ukraine aligning with Western democracies, wanting to be a democracy itself, and potentially Russia also wanting to be a democracy. So then in terms of Yushchenko beating Yanukovych, yeah, so essentially even when Yanukovych won, when he abandoned the EU agreement, then there's protests and his downfall. So either way, the country is showing that they want to be aligned with the West.
Crimea, of course, means a lot to Russians. It has enormous symbolic importance. Of all the territories lost by Russia during the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the loss of Crimea was felt most acutely. His popularity rating shot up.
Putin went on to encourage uprisings of pro-Russian separatists in the east of Ukraine, a conflict that's still going on. Putin's strategy has ensured that the EU and NATO keep Ukraine at arm's length, and stirring up conflict on Russia's borders could help with troubles at home. Putin's popularity is falling. Opposition to his regime is increasing, particularly among the young. In 2021, street protests erupted after opposition leader Alexei Navalny was poisoned and then thrown in jail.
Putin needs a new source of legitimacy, and conflict with the West provides, in his eyes, that source of legitimacy.
Putin portrays himself as Russia's defender against a failing West. Western-style democracy can't be allowed to contrast favorably against his rule, least of all in neighboring Ukraine. A successful democracy next door might lead people to demand the same thing at home.
He is trying to protect his regime and compensate for insecurity and weakness internally by external aggression. And that's what rulers who've exploited their people, who've run corrupt and militaristic regimes have done over decades and centuries. Putin is definitely not the first leader to do that, and in that sense he's fallen into that old trap.
For as long as Putin's political woes continue, Russia's border with Ukraine is unlikely to be left in peace.
So I suppose there are two arguments here, actually. So one is the argument that Ukraine wants to align with Western democracies over Russian dictatorship. So it's an external shift from Ukraine, and then there's the Putin external war helps domestically. So one is kind of the context for the other. Protecting Russia from a failing narrative. So I think this is essentially the point. So I think that's the standard Western narrative that you hear. The next one will be from Jeffrey Sachs, and he talks about a different framing.
In a most fundamental way.
Okay, I think we have time for one very quick final question. We'll go to you on the front row there on the blue shirt on the left.
Thank you so much, Professor Sachs. By your logic of nuclear war having an expected value of negative infinity, it seems that the US should never interfere when a nuclear power is doing something bad. Extending this logic, one could argue that if Nazi Germany had nuclear weapons, we should have just let them walk all over Europe and Russia. Is there a case in which the US should militarily intervene, even if there is some chance of nuclear war?
The U.S. should intervene if we are attacked. That's different. We should not intervene to provoke. And that's the big difference. So let me just explain in 2 minutes the Ukraine war. This is not an attack by Putin on Ukraine in the way that we are told every day. This started in 1990, February 9th, 1990. James Baker III, our Secretary of State, said to Mikhail Gorbachev, NATO will not move 1 inch eastward if you agree to German unification, basically ending World War II. And Gorbachev said, that's very important. Yes, NATO doesn't move, and we agreed to German unification. The U.S. then cheated on this, already starting in 1994, when Clinton signed off on basically a plan to expand NATO all the way to Ukraine. This is when the so-called neocons took power. And Clinton was the first agent of this. And the expansion of NATO started in 1999 with Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic.
So I think the first argument is that there is a promise there's a promise that NATO won't expand.
At that point, Russia didn't much care. There was no border other than with the Königsberg, but other than that, there was no direct threat.
The second piece, so that's the promise. The next one is the escalation. So the historical context. So I think the key thing is there is a promise to Russia, no NATO expansion. Which is James Baker. So I think that's the crux of the promise. And then in terms of the breaking promise of NATO expansion. So in 1994,
then the U.S. led the bombing of Serbia in 1999. That was bad, by the way, because that was a use of NATO to bomb a European capital, Belgrade, 78 straight days to break the country apart. The Russians didn't like that very much. But Putin became president, they swallowed it, they complained, but even Putin started out pro-European, pro-American, actually. He asked maybe we should join NATO when there was still the idea of some kind of mutually respectful relationship. Then 9/11 came, then came Afghanistan, and the Russians said, yeah, we'll support you, we understand, to root out terror. But then came two other decisive actions. In 2002, the United States unilaterally walked out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. This was probably the most decisive event, never discussed in this context. But what it did was trigger the U.S. putting in missile systems in Eastern Europe that Russia views as a dire, direct threat to national security by making possible a decapitation strike of missiles that are a few minutes away from Moscow. And we put in two Aegis missile systems. We say it's defense. Russia says, how do we know it's not Tomahawk nuclear-tipped missiles in your silos? You've told us we have nothing to do with this. And so we walked out of the ABM treaty unilaterally in 2002. And then in 2003, we invaded Iraq on completely phony pretenses, as I've explained. In 2004-05, we engaged in a soft regime change operation in Ukraine, the so-called First Color Revolution. It put in office somebody that I knew and I was friends with, and am kind of distantly friends with President Yushchenko, because I was an advisor to the Ukrainian government in 1993, 94, 95. And then the U.S. had its dirty hands in this. It should not meddle in other countries' elections. But in 2009, Yanukovych won the election, and he became president in 2010 on the basis of neutrality for Ukraine. That calmed things down because the U.S. was pushing NATO, but the people of Ukraine on the opinion polls didn't even want to be in NATO. They knew that the country is divided between ethnic Ukrainian, ethnic Russian. What do we want with this? We want to stay away from your problems. So in February 22nd, 2014, the United States participated actively in the overthrow of Yanukovych. A typical U.S. regime change operation. Have no doubt about it.
This is a very different picture from the Economist video where he's arguing that you again have regime change to remove Yanukovych.
And the Russians did us a favor. They intercepted a really ugly call between Victoria Nuland, my colleague at Columbia University now, and if you know her name and what she's done, have sympathy for me. Really. Between her and the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piat, who's a senior State Department official till today, and they talked about regime change. They said, who's going to be the next government? Why don't we pick this one? No, Klitschko shouldn't go in. It should be Yatsenyuk. Yes, it was Yatsenyuk, and we'll get the big guy, Biden, to come in and do an attaboy, they say, you know, pat him on the back. It's great. So they made the new government, and I happened to be invited.
So I guess the key thing is more about this regime change. And the evidence is the interesting piece.
To go there soon after that, not knowing any of the background, and then some of it was in a very ugly way explained to me after I arrived how the U.S. had participated in this. All of this is to say, the U.S. then said, okay, now NATO's really going to enlarge. And Putin kept saying, stop. You promised no NATO.
So in terms of the intercepted communications, you have this Victoria Nuland So the reason why this is important is because so you have the promise, you have the breaking of the promise, and then you have intercepted communications, which is evidence of regime change with Victoria Nuland, and who was a conversation with
enlargement. It's been, by the way, I forgot to mention, in 2004, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Bulgaria.
(2004) expansion to previous Soviet
Romania, Slovakia.
So in terms of the intercepted communication, so actually maybe this is a better note. I'll just create this one instead. So we don't need intercepted core, we don't need this one anymore. So US regime change in Ukraine. This is the Victoria Nuland call. Breaking promise of NATO expansion.
Slovenia, 7 more countries in the not 1 inch eastward. And then
I guess the key quote is
okay, it's a long story, but the U.S. kept rejecting the basic idea, don't expand NATO to Russia's border in a context where we're putting in goddamn missile systems after breaking a treaty. 2019, we walked out of the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty.
So I guess it's not just NATO expansion and leaving treaties.
In 2017, we walked out of the JCPOA, the treaty with Iran. This is the partner. This is the trust building. In other words, it's completely reckless U.S. foreign policy. On December 15th, 2021, Putin put on the table a draft Russia-U.S. security agreement.
So actually, I think I want to divide this into 2 parts. You have NATO expansion. That's one part. And then the second part is these treaties. So these are the treaties that they broke.
You can find it online. The basis of it is no NATO enlargement. I called the White House that next week after that.
Okay, no, I think that's fine. Breaking promise of NATO expansion. And then there's the 2021 opportunity.
Begging them, take the negotiations. Putin's offered something, avoid this war. Oh, Jeff, there's not going to be a war.
So yeah, this is the key point. It's the failed negotiations.
announced that NATO's not going to enlarge. Oh, don't worry, NATO's not going to enlarge. I said, oh, you're going to have a war over something that's not going to happen? Why don't you announce them? And he said, no, our policy is an open door. This is Jake Sullivan. Our policy is an open door policy. Open door for NATO enlargement.
And then I guess the key thing is promised Sachs wouldn't expand NATO, but couldn't say it publicly because of the open door.
That is under the category of bullshit, by the way. You don't have your right to put your military bases anywhere you want and expect peace in this world. You have to have some prudence. There's no such thing as an open door that we're going to be there and we're going to put our missile systems there and that's our right. There's no right to that. We declared in 1823, Europeans don't come to the Western Hemisphere. That's the Monroe Doctrine. The whole Western Hemisphere, after all. Okay, anyway, they turn.
So I think this is a meta point, which is that Russia has a right for its own security.
Turned down the negotiations. Then the special military operation started. And 5 days later, Zelensky says, okay, neutrality.
Yeah, so that's basically the note I already have. This is not really the note I want to make, but I will tweak it. So I think there is a political So you have this comparison between the Monroe Doctrine. US said to Europeans, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. So similarly, NATO does not have the right to put military bases anywhere it wants. including Russia. So this is kind of a John Mearsheimer point, which we can talk about in separate videos. So you've got failed 2291 negation. Now you have this other negotiation, which is
And then the Turks said, we'll mediate this. And I flew to Ankara to discuss it with the Turkish negotiators because I wanted to hear exactly what was going on. So what was going on was
so this is the kind of second negotiation with the special military operations again. So yeah, that's
they reached an agreement with a few odds and ends. And then the United States and Britain said, no way, you guys fight on. We got your back. We don't have your front, you're all going to die. But we got your back as we kept pushing them into the front lines. That's 600,000 deaths now of Ukrainians since Boris Johnson flew to Kyiv to tell them to be brave. Absolutely ghastly. So when you think about your question, we have to understand we're not dealing with, as we're told every day, with this madman like Hitler coming at us and violating this and violating that, and he's going to take over Europe. This is complete bogus, fake history that is a purely PR narrative of the U.S. government. And it doesn't stand up at all to anyone that knows anything. And if you try to say a word of this, I got completely cut out of the New York Times back in 2022 after writing my whole life columns for them. Oh, I'd send this, okay. And
media censorship and Hitler narrative. This is pretty similar to what The Economist was saying.
by the way, online, it's not even space. You know, there's no limit. They can publish 700 words. They would not publish, since then, 700 words for me about what I saw with my own eyes about what this war is about. They won't do it. We're playing games here. So, God forbid a nuclear power comes at us. I don't know what's going to happen. But we came at them. And we should stop going after China and Taiwan. It's not our goddamn business. Taiwan is part of China. The Taiwanese said it in the Republic of China. The People's Republic of China said it. We agreed to it in countless communiques when we made diplomatic relations with China. So what the hell are we doing sending armaments to Taiwan unilaterally, having our speakers of the House go to Taiwan, inviting a disaster in the future, having publications like you can read now, it's worth looking at, the Navy. We have to understand the most basic points. Stay out of each other's lane so that we don't end up all dead. It's not so.
So I guess this is the meta point, which is the nuclear war threat. Yeah.
So hard. And by the way, if you study another game theory structure, and it's quite interesting for you to do for people who are formal analysts, if you study the hawk-dove game, or the game of chicken, as it's sometimes called, which says, if the other side threatens a nuclear war, don't get into a nuclear war. But if they're being dovish, you threaten to scare the wits out of them. But if both sides collide, then we have nuclear Armageddon. If you study that game formally, and there's a payoff structure for it, and you put, as I suggest, a minus infinity in the quadrant of hawk-hawk, then the equilibrium solution is dove-dove. Okay? The mixed strategy is to put 0 probability on playing hawk, because when you multiply minus infinity times any finite probability, positive probability, you get minus infinity. And so the logic is, don't play chicken with nuclear arms. Don't. And to the CIA director, I say, don't tell me whether Putin's bluffing or not. I read your memo of 2008 about how much Russia is concerned about NATO enlargement to Ukraine. It was leaked by Julian Assange, by the way. The same guy who's our CIA director was U.S. ambassador to Russia then in 2008. He wrote a memo called Niet means Niet, which explained how it's not just Putin, it's the whole Russian political class against having NATO in Ukraine. And then he tells us now, don't worry about it. Because they're playing games with you and me. And I really resent it. So if we someday face this catastrophe that you're presenting, there won't be a good answer, by the way. President Kennedy, incidentally, in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, made a side remark. He said, I'd rather have my daughter be red than dead, when the bumper sticker slogan was better dead than red. And he said it the opposite. You know, he's a human being. He's a wonderful human being. And so I don't know what the answer to the question is, God forbid, but we're not in that situation right now. And the way to get out of that situation is not only to stay out of each other's red lines, but also to disarm. We've got to get back to nuclear arms control. We have a treaty to eliminate nuclear arms signed by, I think now it's 100 countries and ratified by nearly 100 countries, and many others have signed, but not one nuclear power so far. But that's the right answer, is we have to get out of this, what President Kennedy called the sword of Damocles, the nuclear sword of Damocles hanging over our heads, which is really the greatest risk that we face of all.
Thank you. That is that.
I think I just want to find this communique. No means no, Ukraine, Russia. That he's referring to. Can't find the specific thing. Maybe we'll stop there. Yeah, so maybe this is worth adding because it speaks to the fact that it's not just Putin. That weakens the dictator argument or the Hitler argument. And then the nuclear point is separate. I think it's a fairly simple point. We shouldn't play games with